You're listening to The Fromm Connection, a casual, conversational podcast about the ideas of social philosopher Erich Fromm and how they apply today. The Fromm Connection is brought to you by the Erich Fromm Society of North America. For more information about the Erich Fromm Society of North America, visit www.erichfrommna.com, or you can send an email to erichfrommna@proton.me. The views expressed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the Erich Fromm Society of North America, but those of the friends and scholars who appreciate his work. On behalf of my fellow podcast hosts, Kike Autry and Rudy McCormack, I'm Lacey Delane Hunt. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the show.
Today is a relatively rare phenomenon, that we have a great deal of sentimentality, we have a great deal of illusion about love, namely as something one falls in, but the question is that one cannot fall in love really. One has to be in love, and that means that loving becomes, and the ability to love, becomes one of the most important things in life.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Fromm Connection. This is a podcast where we're trying to explore the continual relevance of the great psychoanalyst Erich Fromm in our world today. And today I'm really excited to have a co-host with me, Rudy McCormack, who will introduce himself in just a moment. And then a tremendous guest, a renowned Fromm scholar, Noam McLaughlin, who will give you a bit of an introduction. As you know, if you listened to the first episode, my name is Kike Autry. I'm a practicing psychotherapist in the Houston, Texas area. I'm also a podcaster. I have a podcast on the side called Psyche. And our other co-host, Lacey Delaney, is not able to join us, but hopefully she'll be here for episode 3. Now, with that, Rudy, would you mind just spending a few moments introducing yourself and maybe talking about your connection to Fromm?
Sure, of course. Well, it's good to see everyone. My name is Rudy Leo McCormack. I am a junior scholar at Sam Houston State University, specifically a lecturer. And I did most of my graduate work on the works of Erich Fromm, really ecologizing Erich Fromm. And Kike knows a little bit about this since in his other podcast, we've kind of already delved into and taken a deep dive into my connections and synthesis that I've made on trying to ecologize Fromm's work and everything about Fromm, right? Like all the really cool things that I have already discussed with you and would love to keep talking about here. And
absolutely.
Yeah,
that's great, Rudy. Thank you so much. Now, Neil, would you mind, before we jump into our conversation, just introducing yourself and explaining to the audience your connection to Erich Fromm?
Okay, so I teach, I'm a full professor of sociology at McMaster University in Canada, and I write about the sociology of knowledge and conspiracy theories, political sociology. I have a kind of whole agenda, but in sociology. But it's all started by me writing about Erich Fromm years ago. So I've been writing a lot about why Fromm became forgotten and trying to popularize his work again and work with young people like our 2 co-hosts here and other people on the Fromm Connection to connect Fromm to contemporary issues. So I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, that's really great, Neil. Yeah, we're really excited to have you. So maybe we can just kind of jump right in. You know, as I was thinking about how to formulate the question, I'm struck by the fact that we're trying to make this podcast a space where we point out how Fromm is relevant for us today. And it's interesting that you've done so much research on how Fromm has become a forgotten intellectual, how maybe he's been marginalized or not as relevant as we think he could be. So maybe you could start with what got you thinking about that question of how he became a forgotten intellectual.
So I didn't come from the intellectual world or the left world. You know, I basically was a soccer player. It was kind of I wanted to try play pro soccer in Scotland, where I was born, but I ended up going to the United States on a soccer scholarship, and Erich Fromm's writing made me into an intellectual and a political socialist, and so he was the one who inspired me And then I noticed that his work in sociology influenced a lot of people in the 40s and 50s and 60s to become sociologists.
Mm.
But by the time I was writing about it in the 80s and 90s, he was not seen as a serious figure anymore, although I knew he used to be. And in the same way, in the socialist movement, I was involved in the Democratic Socialists of America for many years. Michael Harrington, Cornel West, and Barbara Ehrenreich were very involved in that. And many people became socialists by reading Erich Fromm. That's what happened to me. And there are hundreds of other people like that. But in the leadership of the socialist movement, I noticed that he wasn't popular anymore. He's sort of gone out of favor. So I essentially wrote my dissertation in sociology about trying to figure out why he became forgotten. Why was he once really famous? Why was he influential in intellectual journals, in the New York Times? The book sold a lot. He was influential in psychology. And by the 90s or so, he was seen as kind of a simplistic thinker, a popularizer, not really radical. One friend of mine once said to me, Erich Fromm, she was a faculty member from Germany, she said, Erich Fromm is a writer for teenage girls. That was sort of a lot of academics came to think that. I don't know what's wrong with writing, ideas for teenage girls. That's one question. But that's sort of the stereotype that had become the dominant. So I wrote sociology on that question, trying to explain that. I did research. I went through articles. I went through books. I counted citations, looked at what was said about him, and documented the rise, the fall of Erich Fromm, and tried to explain it. And I think we're now seeing the rise again, or a revival. So maybe at the end of our conversation, we can talk about that.
Yes. The word that I was looking for was renaissance, but
Okay.
we
Right.
can definitely get to that later in the podcast. I think one of the interesting things that this is my second time reading your article, Neil, and I noticed some really interesting things. Like, one of the questions I had was, how were you able to kind of like recognize the emotional disposition of Fromm when you were talking about aspects of his personality, when you were both kind of like comparing both Derrida and Fromm, but obviously let's focus on Fromm here. And one of the things that I really found really interesting is, how were you able to cartographize, how were you able to find information on Fromm's disposition that may have led to aspects of his rise, but then also parts of his fall, right? That's something that I really would love to get from you.
Well, I think one of the first things, if you're a young scholar trying to do research on a historical topic like this, is you got to go through the secondary literature. So Rainer Funk had documented a lot about Erich Fromm, as had Daniel Burstyn, and the legacy of Erich Fromm. So there was a couple of really important books that had been written, and they had information about his time in Mexico. And then I interviewed Michael Maccabee and got to know a lot of people. Many of them now are in the Fromm Society, who knew Fromm or Maccabee or both. I interviewed David Riesman, who was a very famous Harvard sociologist who was very close to Fromm. So I went through and kind of talked to people who knew him, got the secondary literature, and then I started to read biographies of other scholars, histories of the period, and just started to pick up things. So it was a combination of all those little pieces of things.
And okay, go ahead if you want to ask.
No, go for it.
I just think a good follow-up would be, what were some of the interesting highlights that you saw of Fromm? Because I think as Frommians, we would all wish we could have had conversations with him, and all we can really get are just the the cookie cutter trail, right? Or the trails of Fromm in which we can communicate with him and kind of imagine. I mean, some of the things that I've seen, like the Mike Wallace interviews, right? That's one of the that's one of the ones that I saw where it feels like you can actually, listen to Fromm and also feel like you're speaking to him. What was your gauge on Fromm? Like, what did you think made him the person that he was? And then also, what were some of his limitations too that you noticed?
Well, I come from a sociological perspective. Another person I would mention is Paul Rosen, who was a historian of psychoanalysis at York University in Canada. There's a lot of
Right.
Canadians in the Fromm Renaissance, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
we get back, we can talk about optimal marginality, can kind of explain that. So if you go through his work, he kind of like goes through, and I talked to a number of psychoanalysts who had worked with him as well. So that was another piece of the study. But I'm primarily not a biographer or a psychoanalyst, and other people do better biography. I like to play around with sociological ideas, right? And so
Sure.
I kind of think the thing that was most interesting about him was the fact that he was operating in different worlds at the same time. So he was operating as a psychoanalyst, and there's a whole network of people who he learned about Freud from, and were famous psychoanalysts. And then in New York, then later after he left Germany, and in Mexico, where he started the Psychoanalytic Institute. So he was sort of operating in that world. And then he was operating in the world of sociology. So his advisors, his thesis advisor for his PhD was Alfred Weber, who was Max Weber, the famous sociologist's younger brother. So he
Right.
had a connection to the sociological world. And so I followed through the psychoanalysts who thought about him, and then a lot of people later on were influenced by him, but started to really hate him. And sort of like I kind of noticed that. And
Yeah.
the same thing happened in sociology. A lot of people were really influenced by him, and later on really hated him. And he had this enormous influence in the uh, in the socialist movement. He's really the most famous uh, popularizer of Marx in the 1950s and 60s. Eileen Phillipson, her terrific podcast and her great article about Erich Fromm as the last public psychoanalyst, sort of stresses his role as a public psychoanalyst, as well as, I would say, a public intellectual who was popularizing Marx and socialism. So what I noticed there is this, so it's a whole different thing. You're a sociologist, you're a psychoanalyst, and you're a socialist. And I happen to know a number of socialist leaders who knew Fromm personally. So Irving Howe, the editor of Dissent magazine, a democratic socialist magazine. Michael Harrington, who was the great leader of the socialist movement, who led to the Democratic Socialists of America. He knew Fromm personally. The person who got me to grad school, named Bogdan Denich, he recruited Michael Harrington into the socialist movement back in the 50s at a protest against the Korean War. So he was I worked with him very closely in sociology. And these three great socialist leaders knew Fromm and didn't like him personally. And so I was like, what is that about?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've come to the conclusion that it wasn't just about his personality or about him as a person and his character, even though obviously those things matter. But it was something about the combination of doing these different things all at the same time makes you very creative and makes your ideas a challenge. He was challenging psychoanalysis by bringing in Marxist ideas to psychoanalysis. That made a big contribution to psychoanalysis. It forced psychoanalysis to deal with the social. And Catherine Silver, a psychoanalyst and a sociologist, has talked about this, about the challenge that Marx and Fromm have for psychoanalysis. But at the same time, Fromm is bringing in a challenge to socialism by bringing in Freudian ideas. I remember I talked to Irving Howe. My first writings ever were in Dissent magazine. He helped teach me how to write, and I had some differences of opinion with him politically, but I still respected him as an individual. And one time I was trying to talk to him about Erich Fromm because I was writing my dissertation on Erich Fromm, And I asked him about Fromm, and he kind of just dismissed Fromm. And says, like, I don't want to talk about love. All this talk about love, I want to talk about democratic socialism, right? So that's part of the story. It's kind of Irving was a man of his generation. He didn't want to talk about the kind of stuff that your generation rightly would want to talk about in terms of emotions and the whole thing. So that's kind of how I see it. I probably Rayner and other people, and some of the Mexicans and Sonia Milan and others and Salvador Milan, they will tell you they knew him, or they had conversations with him, and they would have more of a sense of the personality. For me, it was never met Fromm. I just sort of, but it's that's what I try and bring to the table. This sort of emphasis on the sociological. And no way am I suggesting that Fromm wasn't a psychoanalysis, or he wasn't, right? It's just that I'm taking that angle on it to add something to the scholarship.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, do you mind if I ask a question, Rudy? So
Yeah, go for it. Keith.
So in light of that, one of the things that really interests me about the trajectory of how he rose to prominence, but then also became this forgotten intellectual, which you write about, is his deviation from classic Freudian psychoanalysis and moving away from drive theory, and then what happened to him in the Frankfurt School. I wonder if you could maybe trace that out a little bit, because I think that's an important facet of what happened to his relevance.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, if you think about why Fromm became forgotten, it was partly because he was a sociologist and a psychologist, but neither one of those two things. He was caught between disciplines. And then he was a public intellectual who wrote to mass publics, which tends to make you unpopular among academics. So I think that's kind of like the framework to think about why this happened to him. But I think it wouldn't have happened to the same degree. I think he's quite unique. Everybody falls to some extent over time, and people forget.
Sure.
But there's sort of something very specific about Fromm, and it has to do with the point you're making, both with Freud and with Marx. That Fromm popularized Marx in the Freud in the 19 book, Marx too, but he popularized Freud in the 40s and 50s, and Eileen has written about this. And so people who disliked Freud, who wanted psychology to be a science, or B.S. Skinner really hated Fromm, people who wanted psychology to be behaviorist, they hated Fromm because he was a Freudian. So he had a lot of enemies who hated Fromm, and he was popularizing Freud. So you would think Freudians would come on board and help Fromm's reputation and back him. But that didn't work because he was too independent a thinker, and he wanted to critique, starting in the 30s, where he was 20s and 30s, he was a fairly orthodox Freudian. You can see that he was kind of talking about libido theory and sexuality, instincts. He was really like a Freudian in a classical sense. And he had, Dan Burston talks about this. There was this issue of Freud piety. He had a kind of reverence and care and love for Freud as a hero, like many Freudians do. Fromm had some of that, but he broke away from it. And he argued that an excessive focus on instincts misses the social. It misses the sociological, the historical, and it misses the real driver for people is not so much the repression of instincts and the need to express instincts or sexuality, but it's the need for meaning and connection and attachment. That these things that later psychoanalysts have developed, all these themes. Attachment theory comes along, interpersonal psychology comes along, object relations psychology. But so he was sort of early on, wasn't the only person, but he was pushing the Freudians away from this excessively biological instinct model. And it created incredible interest in his work because he was onto something. He was pointing out something. But in a certain way, the Freudians, they killed the messenger, and they took the message. They sort of like took his ideas, not just his, other people. He was part of a group of people that were saying that, but he was the most prominent because he was the most famous. That's why this issue of him being a public intellectual, he was the most famous of those people challenging Freudian orthodoxies. So it created interest. It helped create a new school of critics of Orthodox Freudianism within psychoanalysis, and that's taken off, and other people have developed those ideas in more more sophisticated ways. There was things that Fromm didn't see, he was a person of his time, but he created a space for a revision of Freudian ideas. It made him famous, but it made him unpopular.
Rudy, do you have a question?
Yeah, just I think one of the things happening in the background here that, I think we're talking around it is, and of course directly talking about it too, is this idea that Fromm was, there's an aspect of him that's non-dogmatic, right? Like there's it's almost like he transcends dogmatism, and he really didn't care about the popularity of it. I think he was, obviously this is me speaking for him just because of everything that I've read, but that non-dogmatic ability to transcend the fashion, right, that exists at the time. It just appears like Fromm was really more in the pursuit of truth and trying to really understand what's going on in the phenomenon of, whatever he's investigating of reality, is what I would say. He's trying to really see what's happening in reality. And then also the beautiful thing, I think, about Fromm with his non-dogmatism is that it also applies to that cultural and spiritual element that you kind of mentioned, right? As you said, I think you said Fromm sang Hasidic songs all the way. I think it was a part of the article that you wrote, and I thought that was really interesting. And it made me realize that he kind of embraced exactly who he was, and there's a certain confidence in that. And then at the same time, he knew that probably he was going to get a lot of flack, but it's the reason that you have to have. It's like that internal critique, right? It's an internal critique of the basic assumptions of the beliefs that you hold dear that makes you, at least from my perspective, a great theorist, right? Or a great thinker.
Great. Yeah, I mean, the dissertation that was the basis of that article was called Escape from Orthodoxy instead of Escape from Freedom.
Freedom,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
So it's basically, and that is the creativity of Fromm. I totally agree with you, Rudy. Orthodox Judaism, and he was very much rooted in and influenced by that tradition, a long, proud, ethical tradition. He took some of the great insights of that tradition, but became secular and challenged some ideas that caused, ruffled some feathers. He did the same thing with psychoanalysis. He goes into psychoanalysis and learns some of the great insights of the Freudian tradition, but rejects some of the orthodoxies. He does the same thing with psychoanalysis, and I mean with Marx.
With Marx, yeah.
He does the same thing, and that's the root of his conflict with the Frankfurt School. Is sort of partly around issues of Marx. And it's part of his critique of some of the conflicts he has in the Socialist Party. He also has a critique of mainstream social democracy, he critiques social democracy. So he's doing that all the time. And his critique of sociology was it wasn't dealing with psychoanalysis and psychology. That's one of the reasons why sociologists rejected him. They were moving in a direction where sociologists wanted to establish a science of society that was separate from psychology. That was Durkheim's great insight. Sociologists need to study social facts. Fromm was very much influenced by Durkheim, but he rejected that part. He rejected the idea that you could understand society with only the social. We had to take Freud's ideas. We had to look at depth psychology. Very original, very challenging. Makes yourself enemies. So you fall between the cracks very easily.
Yeah, but I was saying one of the
go for it, Rudy.
Oh, I was just thinking that I do think like even though it makes you just from the way I'm thinking about it, like even though it makes you enemies, I do think there's like a refreshing, especially now in the times that we're in, there's like an aspect of how refreshing that is to see because even the left, and I know you know this, like there's when you have a certain, I always think of the metaphor as like, if you're a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? When you have a framework that you have unquestioned assumptions, right? The problem with having unquestioned assumptions is that you tend to sometimes take sides of certain political phenomena that exist in the world, for example, and you tend to you could side, not necessarily saying that you're siding with the oppressor or the oppressed, but you things could be more complex than they actually appear. And with our dogmatism of the left, for example, we tend to make things black and white from an oppressor and oppressed perspective. And that perspective can sometimes not necessarily be, or it can sometimes be limiting, right? And it doesn't give us a more higher resolution of what's actually going on in a specific phenomena that we're looking at. And with, I think this anti-dogmatism of Fromm, I think it widens the lens a little more than you would see by just, listening to just an Orthodox Marxist just talking to you about, superstructure base and then telling you the historical significance of materialist developments and we're off to the races, right? Everything has a logical unfolding, but in reality, it's just a lot more complexity and uncertainty and what do you call it? Fluidity to it, right? And that gets lost in theories that want specific certain answers about things, right? Even Marxism has a certain aspect of scientism to it, right? Scientism, as
Yeah.
we would call it, right? And I think Fromm dispels us from that. I don't know what you think about that, but
No, I totally agree.
yeah.
I think in the past, we kind of go back and forth. We can go back from the past to the
Hmm.
to today. We've got to remember that. I think that if you think about what was happening in the 40s and 50s, there was a rise, and he had become very famous. And there was a period of time where, identifying yourself with Fromm's ideas was going to make it harder for you to have a career in sociology or a career in political theory, right? There was
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that it wasn't he wasn't a thinker in the 60s, say, or 70s in the academy. It actually differs by different country. Actually, one thing we want to emphasize here, and Rainer Funk was always pushing this, and he's totally right about this. We have to kind of think in a kind of global terms. What I'm talking about really is the rise and fall of Erich Fromm in the Anglosphere, in the United States, in Canada, in Britain. In Latin America, it was quite different. He had much more staying power. He lived in Mexico. He was very popular in Brazil. Even
Mm.
today, he's quite popular in Brazil. In Germany, he declined among academics. My German friend said he was a writer for teenage girls. She was German, so he among academic elites, there's a kind of snobbery about Fromm, but he has
Okay.
he has a kind of resonance in Germany still because he's from there, and so it's different in different countries. In Poland, for example, he's still very popular among leftist young people today because Poland was a bit different because in Poland he was a critic of Stalinism, right? He was a critic, an internal critic of Marxism within Poland. So it had a different feeling there. In Eastern Central Europe, he has a bit more staying power. He didn't decline in quite the same way. So there's national differences, but overall, I would say among academic elites, there has been a decline. And if you're, if you want to sort of like push, write books about Erich Fromm, when I was writing my book, or when Dan wrote his book about the legacy of Erich Fromm, it was kind of like not so easy then. People would be skeptical of Fromm. I think it's different now. There's been a lot of books produced. There's going to be a lot more books out. There's a lot more articles about Fromm in political theory journals and sociology journals and psychoanalytic journals. There's still a legacy of him being forgotten, but I think we're now flipping to a period of time where, because the orthodoxies that these disciplines have been operating are not really explaining. This is you're hinting at here, Rudy, and I agree with you. They're not fully explaining what's going on in the world. So people are looking for alternatives. And I think that's the period of time now that we're entering into. This Renaissance is connected to the breakdown of these orthodoxies within psychoanalysis, within Marxism, within political theory, within sociology. And the world is pushing us to rethink things because things are not going well, politically and spiritually and emotionally for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like in the period of when Fromm became famous, right? It's the same similar dynamic in the 1930s.
Yeah. So I know I really, at one level, want us to jump into kind of this renaissance that we've been talking about that's happening. But before we do that, one of the concepts, Neil, that I think you bring up in your writing about Fromm that's very helpful and was so illuminating for me that I'm hoping you can kind of unpack for this episode is this idea of optimal marginalization. I wonder if you could maybe kind of define what you mean by that and maybe riff a little bit on how that's connected to Fromm and his legacy.
Yeah, because what I was thinking about, so I noticed this issue of Fromm very popular among young socialists and young sociologists, and had a lot of influence among Freudians, and then later on becoming forgotten and being rejected. I kind of noticed that. And it got me to think about kind of reputational theories, about how reputations are created. But that also kind of raises the question of how do you create new ideas? So this is more, the first one is more about reputations, but the second question is more about how do new ideas come into being? Because it seems to me that there was something unique and original about, we don't want to just reduce things to sociology. There was something unique and original about Fromm's ideas, Escape from Freedom, The Sane Society. These books they said something that was different. So I was kind of looking through different theories about why do ideas become, how do ideas become creative? And at the time in the sociological literature, there was kind of like a kind of division between two theories. One theory is that ideas come from the center, from elite, high status institutions. It comes from Harvard. It comes from Yale. It comes from the Enlightenment tradition, the David Hume. It comes from kind of the great philosophers. Ideas come from the center of the world empire, or kind of the institutional center, or it comes from great geniuses and teachers. And so you can think of classical music, where you pass along Bach and Mozart, and you kind of pass on, traditions of great music. So that's a whole tradition, right? And there's something about that I think is obviously both true and untrue. It's both true that there's a big advantage of having resources and a connection to these institutions. And there's a lot of ideas that come out of great universities like Harvard. But it seems to me there's something obviously untrue, that many times elite institutions, they miss something. They miss some things about how the world looks from the perspective of people who are excluded or marginalized, people who don't go to Harvard, people who come from the global South, African Americans, women, gay people, are raising questions about this model of ideas coming from the center. Anti-Semitism is a big factor that marginalized Jews, and without minimizing in any way the suffering and pain and destructiveness that created, it also gave Jews had an ability to see through bullshit, in a way, because they saw, and so there's a lot of great intellectuals like Marx, like Freud, were Jewish, right? So, and Fromm. So that was sort of the origins of it. So I started to say, well, maybe we could get beyond this and say, there's your two choices. Do you want to have the chicken or the pasta? Is it central? Is it kind of creativity comes from the center or it comes from the margins? But maybe we could think about maybe there's a combination of centrality and marginalization. If it's put together in different ways, it could help explain creativity. Because you think about the case of Fromm, he was trained in psychoanalysis by people who knew Freud. So he had a connection to the great Freudian tradition. He was trained by Alfred Weber, not Max Weber, but he wasn't totally marginal to elite sociology. He was probably less involved in Marxism, and Kevin Anderson has written, and Kieran Durkin have written about Fromm and Marxism, and Joan Braun has also written some really important work about Fromm and the Marxist tradition. And so he was probably less connected to Marx as a person than he was certainly less connected to Marx as a person than as he was to Freud. But he had connections to that tradition, and he was well educated in Marxism. So his books were published in major presses in New York City, right? So this was an element of being central that helped him. So it was a combination of being centrally located in great traditions, Freudianism, Marxism, sociology, New York presses, where he could get the books out. He was connected to the Rosa Luxemburg and Trotskyist kind of dissident Marxist traditions. He had some connection to that. So he had and Mexico gave him a perspective on the global South that helps explain why his works resonate in Brazil and in Latin America. So he had a combination of centrality and marginality that I think it helps explain why his work resonated.
Yeah, that's great. Rudy, do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think I really do think like one of the interesting things that as I was listening to you speak was, it's interesting that Marx, you mentioned a lot of names, Rosa Luxemburg, the Trotskyist, right, the dissident Marxist. He has connections with that, and of course, like I think the theme of humanism, runs course all throughout Marx's work. And one of the things that I realized, like, what do you think it was as he was doing his research that made him not move away from humanism, while at that time, in the 60s, 70s, even in the 80s, humanism was basically out of fashion. And yet Fromm was still, uniquely tied to the humanist strain for his work. And it just surprises me. It's just one of the things that I always think about is like, I know that, obviously an answer that I think about is just like, it's the Jewish tradition in him, right? It's the Talmudic scripture. It's all that upbringing, his cultural upbringing that probably kept them within the humanist tradition. But I mean, couldn't you say the same thing for other folks who were also Jewish, but then ended up being, what was it, post-Marxist and also like post-humanist and anti-humanist, as one would call it. What do you think? That's something that popped into my head.
Yeah, no, it's a great. I mean, I tend to take the sociological angle, and it's a bit of an exaggeration, and I know that, I'm aware of that. That's what we all do. We sort of like take an angle on it, and so there's something about the individual. I'm skeptical of hero worship. I've been very influenced by Fromm, and we should all read him, but we don't want to kind of follow into a hero worshiping kind of mode, right? So I'm inspired by him, and I do think his Jewishness was a key element to this. And he took also some of the great ideas of the socialist tradition and a universalism that I think we need to return to, kind of a socialist humanism. Karen Durkin's book is really important for that. It's kind of radical humanism.
Right.
So I don't think we should make it all sociological. He made some choices too, right? He stuck with his guns. He was rooted in those great traditions, the Jewish universalism, socialist universalism. That's kind of key. Good on him. But I don't think it would have happened without these sociological dynamics that made it possible, right? Because, say, if you think about the Frankfurt School, the whole kind of Frankfurt School dynamic, the Frankfurt School, essentially, my sociological angle says, think about the Frankfurt School as a Marxist think tank, where they had money that they were their bequest by a wealthy industrialist, or not industrialist. He was a grain merchant and made money in Argentina, but he had given this money to his son, and that's the nest egg of money that allowed the Frankfurt School to not be full-time philosophers or full-time activists in a party. That's where an intellectual would have to go to somewhere to make a living. This money from the Frankfurt School gave them an opportunity to create independent critical theory. Well, Fromm didn't need that money. He had that money. It helped him write and kind of pioneer the early authoritarian personality research and the Weimar working class in Weimar Germany, where he develops a theory about what today we could call left-wing authoritarianism. But it's the fact that he was a psychoanalyst who could make money with patients, right? And then later on, he wrote a best-selling book, Escape from Freedom, that meant that he wasn't necessarily pressured to fall in line with Freudian orthodoxy or sociological orthodoxy, right? I think that's a key thing. I
think that's a great point.
That is a great point. Yeah,
He
gets
almost had the
overlooked.
freedom, right?
Yeah. It gave him a freedom. But it was a dangerous freedom because it also pissed people off, right? Because he was free, he was willing to say stuff that other people didn't necessarily want. The Freudians didn't want to hear. Erik Erikson had very similar critiques of orthodox libido theory, but he really backpedaled on it, or soft pedaled it. He sort of snuck in. I think Daniel Burstyn talks about what he calls crypto revisionism in his book. It's sort of like you're basically revising Freud, but you're not directly critiquing Freud. You're sort of smuggling in but Erikson was very dependent on the Freudian networks. He had been trained by Anna Freud. He was very close to the Freudian networks. He didn't want to directly challenge them. Fromm had no reason to sort of soft pedal this. He was very direct in his criticisms, and I think it has to do with the fact that he's doing these different things at the same time.
Yeah,
right? He would to sort of play these things off each other in a way.
So what do you guys think about this? So, and I on the one hand, am troubled by the kind of misogyny in that statement, Neil, that your colleague made, right? That Fromm's writings are for, teenage girls. Do you think the fact that he was so clear and was such a popularizer, bringing these difficult ideas into kind of a space where like the masses could understand it, do you think that actually hurt him in the end?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, just the statement about the teenage girls was actually written by a woman scholar, so it's kind of an internalized.
Interesting.
But and I think here Lynn Chancellor's work on Fromm is very important. I mean, Fromm contributed to this problem because the way he talked and his language, and it's also I would think sociologically, like he was in Mexico and he wasn't around the U.S. when the feminist movement really took off, and he wasn't. If he'd been around in the U.S. in the early feminist movement, he would have been confronted more about it, the language that he used, and he might have refined his language, and I think he might have had more followers if he kind of adopted a kind of a little bit more modern language. And that's sort of sociological in a sense. Like the people he was hanging around with were not people who were pushing him on that. And it might have been it might have been a different thing. But I would say yes, 100%, that, and this is more, this is something I feel very strongly about, is that there is no question that a lot of graduate students and scholars who make their career on very convoluted, abstract ideas don't have an interest in clarity, because there's a tendency to part of what an academic does is distinguish themselves from non-academics or non-elites. And sometimes that's necessary. I don't want to play into a anti-intellectual populist and critiquing professors and their specialization. But there's a tendency, I would say, try to keep things as simple as possible. And if you need technical language for a reason, you need to do that. But if you can avoid it, try and argue with clarity. And he did that. But the problem with that, in terms of reputational issues, is that when he made mistakes, sometimes when his ideas about gender were not as progressive as they should have been, it's clear. It's very clear. Sometimes people who are, and we should critique and move beyond that and develop new ideas inspired by Fromm, but moving well beyond him. But the clarity hurt him. And there are a lot of thinkers who say really things that we want to be quite critical of, but it's not exactly that clear what they're saying, because it's in such a abstract language, so people will, not address it, or they don't understand. They'll kind of read in something more promising or more something that they like, and not confront some of the outdated things that are in the text. So I think being convoluted can sometimes help your reputation, but in a way that doesn't help intellectual work or moving ideas.
Yeah. So I think it's probably a good time to maybe transition into kind of this modern renaissance of Fromm and how he's impacting things. I wonder, Rudy, if you could start. I mean, I know you've done some great work on, Fromm and eco-anxiety, and there's all these different fields you work in where you're seeing some Fromm kind of renaissance. Yeah, what are you kind of excited about in terms of the scholarship and what's happening out there?
Yeah, I'll just start with I gotta give it a shout out to Kieran Durkin. He's the one who I don't know if he's the one who popularized the Fromm Renaissance, but he was the one that I was exposed to, and then the word Fromm Renaissance actually, took hold in my mind. As I remember, I interviewed him for a class once, and then as I started talking to him more, and he told me about his works, I started reading more into his works, and I started to realize, like, oh crap, I'm not the only person who thinks Fromm is, needed for this day and age, for the present day and age that we're living in. And that was kind of the exposure I needed to be a part of this new renaissance, which I had no idea I was being a part of. I just saw a connection, and I'm like, oh, here I go. I'm gonna go down these rabbit holes. That's kind of like what I did. And like, as Neil kind of mentioned, Fromm is clear. And I think as a young scholar trying to find limits in the folks I'm influenced by, it was a lot easier to see where the limits were located in Fromm, because, as Neil said, it's very clear where his limits are. And one of those limits was actually the way he talks about nature. Obviously, he changes his mind over the course of his development in his writings. I think in like the later 60s and the 70s, he starts to create this more interconnected idea of nature and humanity, but he still doesn't go all the way. And then, of course, in his earlier works, you could see that he had almost like the traditional Marxist understanding that nature is this resource. It's a passive element, and he uses words like passivity, and it's something out there separate from us. We're freaks of nature is one of the words he once used. So those things I thought were actually problematic in the way that I wanted to update Fromm's canon, right? How do we update Fromm's language, kind of like what Neil was talking about too? And I think actually talking about this makes me realize like that's actually my responsibility, a part of this like Fromm Renaissance, right? My responsibility as a testament to Fromm is to be non-dogmatic, to follow that theme of Fromm's anti-dogmatism, and at the same time recognize, now hero worship, but recognize the limitations and work from those limitations to actually further the conversation along, right? Further that theory along, further the framework of Fromm, because I actually do think in the actual fundamental essence of Fromm's works, a lot of these more marginal issues, like the use of language, and maybe not being as crisp in some of the theorizing that he does, was almost like like as Neil says, a sociological product of his time, but also maybe a carelessness. Like, you make choices and you become careless. Maybe it's something that he took for granted, didn't really think about, especially nature. We're a lot more aware of our relationship with nature now. And I think he himself started to realize, like, as I saw his works later on, he himself started to realize like the importance of nature in relationship to human beings, and the relatedness category that he was talking about, how nature actually has a very specific connection to that interrelationship with how human beings recognize themselves in relationships with the environment, right? So those are the kinds of things that I'm doing in my own work, especially with climate emotions. I'm just in my own work, I'm basically just, like at a more general level, I'm criticizing a bit the more behavioral and diagnostic approach to psychology, and just saying that there's, taking this Frommian perspective, like there's just a collective actual pathology. Here's a collective, right, pathology of normacy that we're not really talking about, which we don't take for granted, or we don't even notice, right? We don't even notice because, as Fromm says, psychologists aren't in the business of talking about what's wrong with society. They're in the business of diagnosing the individual, right? So that was one of the things that I problematized using Fromm's work. But then within Fromm's work itself, within the dimensions of Fromm, I think one of the things that I pushed further was getting this idea of climate emotions and really talking about them from a perspective that is respectful of Fromm's theory, but at the same time pushes Fromm further, right? And that's what I'm still working on publishing that first
Sure.
article, which I'm gonna try to do now that I have a break. I'm gonna work on it on the break. But yeah, I can't wait. Once it comes out, I'll definitely send it to you, so you all can
Oh,
read
that'd be
it.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Consider how maybe the optimal marginality idea can kind of help us think about this, because the early ideas of Fromm in Escape from Freedom, and they've gone everywhere and through these popular books over the
Right.
generation. Books still sell, and the ideas are very inspiring. I think the Renaissance has changed things because of what's happening in the world, because of Trump and the rise of far right-wing authoritarianism, and maybe maybe some things that we have to rethink on the left. But it seems to be the first thing to think about is the far right authoritarianism, the environmental crisis, and there's a whole bunch of things in the world that are making Fromm more relevant again, and the radical humanism relevant. But you want it, but it's spread everywhere. So you want to think about, when you're thinking about Fromm, maybe I'm just a podcast listener who likes to listen to Fromm, and in sort of audio books. I like to read Fromm, and I'm just going to use Fromm to inspire me in my life and learn stuff. And that's sort of one thing. Then there's other people who are in different fields who might want to try and build on Fromm within their field. So you want to think about it sociologically. If you want to bring in Fromm, as you're doing, Rudy, to political theory around the issue of ecology, you want to think, okay, what can I take out of Fromm, and how can I build a career as a political theorist without marginalizing myself totally, right?
Right.
Really fight these old battles, right? You want to sort of, become a respected, well-regarded, well-published political theorist, bringing in Fromm in a useful way. Or if you're a therapist and you want to do therapy work, then some of these academic discussions are not so important. Then the question becomes, how can Fromm's ideas update psychoanalytic practice or therapeutic practice for today? It's a whole different question. And so you want to think about what you're trying to do in your own life. And then and people were trying to do all these different things. Fromm did it on his own. Now we have opportunity for different people to work together on that renaissance.
Yeah, that's really great and exciting. So I think we're maybe coming to the end of our conversation. I wanted to just throw out one last question for the two of you. Yeah, is there anything else that you would want to share with the listeners about Fromm that's relevant to what we've been talking about before we come to a close? And I know we've discussed quite a few things, and it's been really great. Do you have anything, Neil or Rudy?
Well, I mean, I do have something in mind, but I'm not sure if we have enough time to actually cover it because it could turn into a whole other conversation. Well, I guess we can maybe just hit on it, maybe hint on it, so that maybe we can like leave that off and maybe have
Sure.
another conversation about it another time. But Neil, if you could talk about, obviously there's the whole issue with the Israel-Hamas situation going on in the world right now. And what was Fromm's position on, Zionism and Israel having, a land of their own? Him being a Jewish scholar and him also just being Jewish himself. What do you think his positions would be? I have an idea, but I'd rather see what you had to say.
I definitely think that's a conversation for another time to prepare it and think about it. I mean,
Yeah.
Fromm was anti-Zionist, and he had about all of the Frankfurt School. He had a strong critique of Zionism, and he spoke out for Palestinian rights in a very vocal and principled way. And it's rooted in a Jewish tradition of anti-Zionism and ethical universalism. The story of today is so much more complicated. One issue is what should have been done in 1948,
Right.
and then there is a question of what to do today. And if you read about his position on the urban terrorism, the Baader Meinhof group in Germany, I mean, Fromm opposed suicide bombings. He opposed the killing of innocent people. He opposed atrocities on innocent people and terrorism. He opposed that. And so seems to me one needs to have an ethical, moral reaction to killing innocent people and murdering and not trying to minimize that and sort of make excuses for that. I think that would be one piece, but he didn't live to see the current crisis, and we'd have to have another conversation. On the other hand, so that is one thing I think that we can be assured of, that he wouldn't justify, excuse, look away from. Every life is precious. Cornel West talks about every Jewish child is precious, every Palestinian child is precious. I mean, that is something that we have to, that West and Erich Fromm would absolutely agree on. At the same time, Fromm had an ethical and moral commitment to Palestinian rights and the complexities about how you create a world where Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs can live, and Muslims can live together in the Middle East without all the brutality and killing and insane escalations that we're living through now. We'd have to bring in experts on the Middle East and have to have a kind
of course.
Maybe that could be, the next episode or something in the future, just given the state of the world. But Rudy, I think that was a great question. And Neil, I really appreciate your nuanced thoughts on that. But yeah, maybe we can kind of come to a close. And for anyone who's listening, we're hoping to have obviously more of these episodes once a month, maybe a little bit more. So stay tuned for episode 3. We'll let everyone know kind of what that's going to be about. But before we end, just thank you so much, guys. And yeah, we'll continue this conversation.
What
Thank
a
you
great,
so much.
great podcast. Thank you so much. Looking forward
Thank
to
you,
working
Neil,
with
for coming along. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at the Fromm Society of North America, we want to thank you for listening to today's episode of the Fromm Connection. The Fromm Connection is brought to you by the Erich Fromm Society of North America, a group of individuals who are passionate about sharing the ideas of Erich Fromm. For more information, visit www.erichfrommna.com.